This talk that I'm going to give today is kind of derived from this book I published a couple of years ago about the long-run history of social mobility. And in particular, what I want to talk about today is the question about what makes our social position what it is. To what extent, if we were born into a different family, into different circumstances, would outcomes be different? And in that sense, to what extent can society have any hope of changing the rate of social mobility? And so what I want to start with is to say, well, what's the received kind of vision of social mobility in modern societies? And the important thing in terms of thinking about social mobility is that to measure it, we need just one very simple number. And that is the extent to which children are correlated with their parents in terms of any measure of social status. Could be occupation or wealth or earnings or longevity. And if that number is 0, what it implies is that every generation is born completely anew and that history determines nothing. If that number is 1, then what it says is that the past completely determines the present, right? And so what we're interested in is, what is that number truly in societies? What's the correct measure of that number? And then the second, as I say, very important question is, why is that number what it is, right? What is it that's determining the link between generations? Now, if you look at the conventional measures of social mobility, they actually suggest very powerful conclusions about the nature of social mobility. And so this picture here shows the correlation of earnings in various societies, right? And remember, 0 implies complete social mobility, 1 implies complete immobility. And then that's ranked for these societies in terms of how unequal their income distribution is. And when you look at that picture internationally, what you'll see is a group of economies mainly found in Northern Europe, which have very low levels of income inequality and very high measured rates of social mobility. There's another group of countries in South America which have very high levels of inequality and very low rates of social mobility. There's very strong persistence. And then you'll see the United States, United Kingdom are right here in the middle, right? And then you see interesting things like China actually has measured rates of social mobility as a communist society, which are lower than in the United States. And so this is the conventional picture. And from this picture, actually, some important implications would emerge. One is that social mobility rates, based on this conventional picture, are actually extremely high. Because if you want to explain how much of variation in income in current society comes from inheritance, then what you have to do is just square that intergenerational correlation. And so if the intergenerational correlation is 0.2, as it is in Scandinavia, then it says that only 4% of all current variation in income is actually explained by inheritance. And 96% is being created anew in each generation. And so that's a kind of interesting thing when you think about the political movements in modern America. Even in the United States, those conventional numbers imply that only about 1/4 of all inequality is actually explained by inheritance, and that most inequality is somehow generated anew within each generation. And so the surprising thing about the conventional numbers is they actually imply very rapid social mobility. And if these numbers continue for more than 1 generation, what it would say is within 2 or 3 generations, everyone's equal, right? We don't live in a class society. We live in a society of almost complete mobility, right? And so that's one of the things that's surprising about the conventional numbers. But the second thing these numbers imply is that there is actually a social mobility problem. Because the fact that these numbers vary so much across societies says that it must be possible in all societies to have much higher rates of social mobility, right? If the intergenerational correlation is 0.7 in Chile and it's 0.2 in Norway, then what it's saying is a society like Chile is having a lot of people who by accidents of birth are ending up in a very different social position than they potentially could end up in, right? And so what this data, with the enormous variations we see in these intergenerational correlations, it seems to imply that you really do have this social problem of social immobility, and that somewhere like the United States, the right economic and political and social policies could dramatically change life outcomes for a lot of people, right? And then another thing that the conventional estimates imply is that what matters to people's social success has to be features like culture or education or social networks, and it can't just be the differential inheritance genetically of abilities. Because that inheritance of abilities is going to be very similar across different societies. And so if you see these very different social mobility rates, then it says, well, something else must really matter to social mobility. If it really is the case that the intergenerational correlation is only 0.2 in terms of social position, then what it's saying is that genetics can't matter that much, because people inherit genetics as strongly in Scandinavia as they do in Chile, but you're getting these very different social outcomes. And so this is just a kind of review of what the conventional wisdom would suggest about social mobility. And so as I say, it's got surprising elements. It actually says that social mobility is surprisingly fast. It's got important political elements, because it says that it's something that societies have to decide about. That if Bernie Sanders wins the election, as opposed to Cruz, that it could potentially make a big difference to a lot of people's life outcomes, right? And so it says that political systems, political structures, these things really matter, okay? And it also says that if you want to explain people's outcomes, it's not their inherited abilities that really matter. It's their inherited social circumstance and relatives and connections and culture. These are the things that matter. Now, the limitation of these conventional approaches, though, are that they look just at one generation. And they also look just at one aspect of people's status. And so they're giving a very imperfect picture of what the overall process of social mobility is. And so in my book, what we use is a very different way of measuring social mobility, but a way that allows us to look at mobility over many generations and to actually trace the process over multiple generations and actually looking at many more aspects of status. And what we actually use here is surnames as a way of tracking how much social mobility there is in society. And so a strange thing, most people here in this room probably don't know much about their relatives beyond their grandparents. And that's your kind of your known picture of the past. But many of you are carrying surnames that are linking you to people 10 or 20 generations into the past. And it's this one strange marker that people are carrying around with them, right? And so, for example, the name Clark is an occupational surname, and it was the name for priests and attorneys in medieval England. And so I have no knowledge beyond my grandfather, but holding that name implies that sometime in medieval England, someone in my lineage was either a priest or an attorney, right? It actually turns out that it was also the name given to the servants of priests and attorneys, and so much more likely, some of my relatives were cleaning the toilets of priests or attorneys, right? Because Clark is actually not a high status name in any way. And so surnames link us in this way, and for example, in England, the Norman conquerors were the first people to bear surnames. And these surnames then link, like 0.4% of the modern English population can be linked back to the Norman conquest. And so a name like Montgomery is the name of a village in Normandy. that a very distinguished family came from, and they were, as I say, the first people to bear those names, and they've carried down into the present period. And by the way, very interestingly, in England, people with these Norman surnames are much more likely to be employed in the army than other people even 600 years after the Norman conquest, right? And so there was something that people were actually kind of transmitting over multiple generations. And so just to take an example, one of the things we can use in England is very rare surnames. And so there's a famous family, the Pepys. And there's a famous Pepys who had a diary in 1660 to 1670, which gives an incredible insight into life amongst the upper classes in England in that period. But he came from a very distinguished family where every holder of that surname seems to descend from an obscure founder in the 15th century. And so we can actually, by looking at these surnames, we can actually trace social mobility over many, many generations. And based on this modern data on social mobility rates, what we would expect to see with the surnames would be that after 3 or 4 generations, all surnames would have average status because they would lose any information about higher or lower status relatively quickly in a society with rapid social mobility. So surnames allow us to kind of measure social entropy. They allow us to measure the rate at which the social system is losing information about status. And as I say, these surnames we would expect to become very average, particularly the common ones, over time, as social mobility is occurring. And so then what we can do for England is we can go to 1800 to 1830, and we can take rare surnames, and then we can just ask a simple question. Was someone with that surname attending Oxford or Cambridge at that point? And Oxford and Cambridge were the top 1%. They were the only universities in England at that period. And about 1% of males in England went to Oxford or Cambridge. And so if you had a rare surname and someone with that name was at Oxford or Cambridge, that implies that it's probably a fairly distinguished surname, right? And remember, these are surnames that are only held by 30 people at that time. And so this is going to be, the family of this surname is going to be associated there. And actually looking at these surnames, I can tell that some of them are very distinguished families in England, right? And then we can take, these are the surnames where no one with the surname attended Oxford or Cambridge, and you can see that these surnames look very similar, right? It's a whole variety of surnames. There's nothing that looks particularly different that identifies these names that happen to be at Oxford or Cambridge. And then what we can do is we can say for every generation from 1530 up till the present, how much overrepresented were these names at Oxford or Cambridge? And in that initial generation, these names were more than 50 times as likely to show up at the university than the average name. But what's interesting is that it's still the case, these are two different measures, that these names now, in 2010, are still 4 to 8 times more likely to be at Oxford or Cambridge. And you can even go into the past and say in 1530, these names were still relatively unusually represented at Oxford or Cambridge. And from that overrepresentation, we can actually calculate what's the implied intergenerational correlation of status that's represented by how overrepresented these names are at the universities. And the interesting answer for England is that rates of social mobility here are very slow when you look at surnames. That the correlation of status across generations is in the order of 0.8. It's much, much higher than any of this other data would suggest. But the other astonishing thing is that it doesn't change over time. That you can fit all of this, and so what's happening here is these fancy families are becoming more average, but they're becoming more average at a very constant rate. And the other thing you can see is that to get to this position, they actually moved away from the mean, but they moved away from the mean also at this very constant rate. And what's amazing here is that in 1800, there was no compulsory education in England. Oxford and Cambridge were private universities and were gentlemen's clubs. Now, when I attended, I'm in this data set myself, I attended Cambridge. When I attended, it was all paid for by the government, and you sat public exams to attend the university, though they were very specialized exams that only certain schools would prepare people for, right? Now people are admitted through the normal high school final exams. What's amazing in England is that has had no effect on the measured rate of social mobility. The persistence of high status people at these universities, it hasn't been affected by the arrival of universal education. It hasn't been affected by the move, by the admission of women to the universities. It hasn't been affected by public support for the universities. It hasn't been affected by having standardized exams for the universities. Nothing has changed this rate of social mobility, right? And the Industrial Revolution occurs in the middle of all of this. It makes no impact in terms of the movement of people in and out of universities. And so what's amazing is that when we turn to surnames and start looking at long-run social mobility, looking at the surname distributions and the movement of those elite names towards the average, it gives this very different picture, which is saying that Bernie Sanders is absolutely right. We live in a class society, and that there is incredible degree of persistence of status from one generation to the next, right? And I'm going to come and say, well, why are these results so different in a little bit? But that's the results we get for England. And then the important thing is when we're looking at surnames, one thing I should clear up is that involves looking at the patriline, right? And it's not because I hate women that I'm using this method. It's just because of the sexist nature of society where names are adopted in most societies through the patriline. And so we're looking at one particular line of descent then in looking at the patriline. And so one thing that comes up is, well, maybe that's an unusually rigid line of descent. Maybe there's a lot more persistence on that line than there are on the various other lines of descent. But we can check in England that that's not the case. And the way we can check is, well, we can compare sons in these families to sons-in-law. And what you find is that women in high status families, for example, marry men who look just like their brothers in terms of their social status. And men marry women who look just like their sisters, right? And so it's actually the case that the persistence of status it's very similar whether we used women or we used men. It really is just a feature of families in these societies that status is actually persisting. It's persisting very strongly as picked up by these surnames, and it's not to do with a particular inheritance. Now, I should explain a little kind of intellectual history. When I got involved in this project, I was excited by the idea as a historian of measuring social mobility going back to the Middle Ages. I expected to get very similar numbers to the ones that you would find in conventional estimates, but I would just be able to estimate these numbers going back in time. It took me more than a year to try and figure out why are these numbers so different than the conventional numbers, right? I just blundered around, not able to understand why are these numbers so different. But once you actually recognize that, then you can actually look at things in history and you can see that there really is a truth here about the slowness of social mobility. And so let's just take as an example, Charles Darwin, famous English scientist. And the nice thing about him is he's so famous that people have tracked all of his descendants. And he had a lot of descendants. He had 10 children, or he and his wife had 10 children. But amazingly, he only has 27 great-great-grandchildren. And so there's actually a demographic collapse that occurs in later generations in the Darwin family. But the amazing thing is that if conventional estimates about social mobility rates were correct, his great-great-grandchildren should just be average people. They should be, clerks, bus drivers, teachers, they should just be a mix of ordinary people. If you look at his great-great-grandchildren, of those 27, 11 are notable enough to have Wikipedia pages devoted to them, or to, when they died, to have an obituary in the Times of London. And they do everything. They're university professors, they're authors, they're doctors. The department I come from is a pretty good economics department. It's ranked about 30th in the entirety of North America. his great-great-grandchildren are more distinguished than myself and my colleagues, right? I mean, this really is a persistence of eliteness in these societies that is not kind of contemplated in modern social mobility data, right? And this is just one example. And by the way, who did his grandchildren marry? They married a bunch of other people descended from the elite in England. Some of Charles Darwin's grandchildren are called Keynes. And remember, Maynard Keynes, that's another very elite family. Others of them are called Huxley as the last name, and that's Huxley, the biologist. These guys are actually all kind of intermarrying with each other. And so this study was done in England from 1300 to 2012, and what it suggests is that the intergenerational correlation of status is between 0.7 and 0.8, all the way since the Middle Ages. But we can also do it for Sweden, United States, Chile, India, Japan, China, all the way through the book we do this. And then since the book, we've looked at Australia. The interesting answer that you get is that whatever conventional estimates are, when you look at surnames, there's actually an incredible degree of persistence in status in all of these societies. Surnames just show this very high degree of persistence. And just to kind of illustrate this, let me show you Sweden as another example, because Sweden is a nice case to look at because Sweden has incredibly high measured rates of social mobility, right? And it's the kind of nirvana for people who believe in the equality of opportunity. And it turns out that in Sweden, you can actually get nice measures of elite names because Sweden has an aristocracy which is divided into the counts and the barons and the untitled nobility, and they actually still exist in Sweden. They were created in the 17th and 18th century when Sweden was an imperial power in the Baltic. It conquered parts of North Germany, it conquered Lithuania in this period, and it hired a lot of high-level military talent to come in and conduct these wars, and then the reward was to become count, right? And so Count von Essen, for example, is one of the Swedish noble families. And so you get these names, and the nice thing about Sweden is that in English tradition, and also in America, you can call yourself anything you want. Not only do we have the right to bear arms, at least in America, but it's a tradition of England that you can call yourself whatever you want. If you want to wake up tomorrow and call yourself Count von Essen, go ahead, right? And, but in Sweden, you cannot do this. There are naming laws, and all of the names of this nobility are protected names that no one else can take. And that's been the case since 1900. And so there we actually know that any descendants with these names are actually going to be these actual people, right? And it's also interesting in Sweden, if you want to change your name, you have to get government permission. And so there's actually the tax bureau controls names as well. And there's a website where you can go if you want to change your name. And they actually have suggestions about names you might like to adopt if you don't want your current one. And it turns out Swedes actually don't hold on to names that much. And so there's a lot of name changing going on, but it's all actually controlled by the government. But the nice thing is that then we have an exact count of names in Sweden, because as I say, it's all under this government bureaucracy. And so that's the first class of names. And then there's a second class of names in Sweden, which are Latinized names. And so the traditional Swedish names all end in S-O-N. So it's Eriksson, Svensson, whatever. But when people attended university in Sweden, again in the 17th and 18th century, one of the things they would do often is change their name and adopt a permanent surname. And so a lot of Swedish scientists are known by such names. So Celsius is a Swedish scientist, right? The temperature grade. Linnaeus. And so there's a whole class of Swedes who have names that said, someone in your family got a degree back in the 18th century, right? And we can again track these people through time. And so as I say, in Sweden, we get these nice measures where we have both a nobility, and then also we have the educated elite, where we can actually track the names through time. And as I say, the conventional picture should be that these names should be absolutely average by now in Sweden. And, oh, and by the way, this is the House of the Nobles, the Knight's House in Stockholm. And so they actually have, this keeps the genealogies of all of the upper classes in Sweden, right? The noble families. And then this shows that when these noble names were created. And so this is when the families were created. So it's almost over by 1800. And by then, Sweden had lost most of its overseas territories, so it wasn't making new nobles anymore. And then this is the net stock of families that had these names. And you can see that some of the names are actually dying out just by demographic processes. And so aristocratic surnames have this very characteristic form. So Leijonhufvud, lion's foot. And this is actually, there's a well-known economist with this name from UCLA. And then Gyllenstierna, gold star. And there's a Hollywood, Gyllenhaal. There's some actors in Hollywood who are actually from the Swedish nobility as well, right? And so you can recognize these are very distinctive names. And then, as I say, the Latinized surnames you can recognize now. They end in IUS or EUS. And so again, they're very distinctive. And the nice thing about Sweden is that they have complete openness about everything. And so they publish everyone's tax return every year. And so if you want to know how the Leijonhufvuds are doing, just go to the tax returns. And this says what your earned income was and what your capital income was in 2008. And it's published by private companies under the slogan, "Know what your neighbor earns." And it's like a burglar's handbook, right? Because you can see, oh, single woman living on her own, pretty good income, good place, right? And so this is, as I say, so Sweden is an interesting society. It's very open about these types of information. And here's an interesting thing. As I say, 200 years after these noble names were last created, if you look at the distribution of income of noble names, and then the distribution of names, all names in Sweden, you'll see that the nobles are still overrepresented amongst the elite, and they're still underrepresented amongst poor people in Sweden, right? And that implies, because this is 8 generations later, that actually implies there must be very slow rates of social mobility. Now, the important thing is, in all of these societies, there is eventual mobility. Your descendants are going to be average if you're elite, but it's going to take 300 years, right? And so in some sense, there's a philosophical issue here. You do find complete mobility in all these societies. You just have to wait 10 generations, right? But why should 10 generations rather than 2 matter that much, right? And so this is what we get. And then, so one of the things we can just look at is how overrepresented are these names amongst Swedish doctors from 1890 to 2011. And what you find is that they're heavily overrepresented. It's declining over time. But the intergenerational correlation of status that implies in Sweden is something like 0.72, right? And so Sweden, despite the measured income figures, is not showing very high rates of social mobility. Another thing we can look at is the Swedish Royal Academies. And then here's elite names, the IUS names, the noble names in the Swedish Royal Academies. They're 64 times more likely to be in the academy than the average person back in the 18th century. They're still 4 times more likely to be in the academies. What's the implied intergenerational correlation of status there? It's 0.87, right? And then the common names in Sweden are the ones that end in SON. People with those names in Sweden are as underrepresented as, say, minority populations in the United States in terms of elite status in somewhere like Sweden. And you can see that they're getting back towards the average, but it's only going to take another 200 years until we have complete equality in somewhere like Sweden. And so what's interesting, as I say, is that, and then you get this slow rates of social mobility. We can estimate it by period. We can estimate it using different groups of people. The answer is, again, that there's an astonishing level of persistence of status measured at the level of surnames. And the other very surprising thing is that it's a very common rate of persistence, right? It's somewhere in the range of 0.7 to 0.8 wherever we look, right? And one of the societies we looked at was communist China. It has a similar rate of persistence, right? you really get this kind of very common rate. The only exception to this was India. And the exception to India is that it's even higher, the persistence rate in India. It's something like 0.9 for Brahmin surnames, right? And so the interesting thing with surname data is you get, as I say, this incredible rates of persistence. Now, why are these results so different? You know, and which is the correct result, right? So if you go to the one generation studies, you would say, hey, Sweden, there's all kinds of social mobility going on. On the other hand, if you look at membership in doctors, amongst attorneys, amongst elites in Sweden, you would say, good heavens, it's still dominated by this traditional elite. And so the question is, what is it that is happening here? And the argument of the book is that what the surnames are capturing is a deeper measure of social status. And that we all have this measure, but we don't even know what it is, right? And that what happens is that there's a lot of accidents that affect people's lives and that affect individual measures of status. And so, for example, when I was an undergraduate, I started off studying philosophy. Now, fortunately, I was not a very good philosophy student, and so I switched to economics. And now, if I'd continued in philosophy, I'd still be the same person I am, but my income would have been about half what it is now, right? And so just the choice of subject can have a very significant influence on your income. What company did you happen to sign up to work for, right? I mean, there's people who signed up for Facebook, and there's people who signed up for what was the other one that went bust? MySpace, right? They weren't fundamentally different people. Some people get lucky and some people get unlucky. And so the argument here is there's lots of elements of accident. And when we're measuring individual aspects of status, you know, if we compare English professors with business school professors in Davis, the salary difference is about 3 to 1. Their social status doesn't differ by 3 to 1, right? It's just one aspect of their status. There's lots of other aspects. There's people, you know, they sign up for a graduate program and it doesn't work out for them and they end up doing something else. So then in terms of educational status, they don't have a PhD as opposed to someone who does have a PhD. So the idea here is there's lots of accidental elements in our lives, right? There's lots of these elements, but there's some underlying status that we carry. And what's happening is the accidental elements, when we make normal measures of status, we're looking at a lot of these accidental elements, and we get an impression then of a lot of mobility, right? But then if we had a more comprehensive inventory of what's happening to these families as a whole, what we'd actually find is much more persistence. And what this data is revealing, for example, is suppose that someone has a PhD and then their child just completes high school. It turns out to be, in the data, very strongly predictive that their grandchildren will tend to bounce back, right? And it actually shows up in the data that your lineage actually matters, and that it's more than one generation that matters here, right? And that if you come from a very educated background, even if one kid doesn't do so well, it tends to be then that the later generation actually tends to bounce, but they've got some kind of memory. Hold on, we're supposed to be educated, right? And so what is happening here, the claim is that the surnames are actually capturing that kind of deeper movement of status, whereas the conventional measures are tending to look mostly at the kind of surface kind of froth in terms of status. And then the question comes up, well, why does it show then much more mobility in someone like Sweden when we look at earnings than in the United States? And the answer here is, in Sweden, income distribution is very compressed. Bus drivers and architects in Sweden earn very similar amounts of money, so that your actual earnings don't say that much about your social status. In somewhere like the United States, earnings tell you a lot more about social status. They're a much better measure of that overall social status. And so that's why when societies are very unequal in terms of income, they tend to actually show much less social mobility. It's because the income now is giving you a much better estimate of what is the overall status of people, right? And so the idea here is, as I say, you carry this underlying social status. This is a thing that's inheritable, and then you have these kind of accidental aspects. And we need to do some much more comprehensive inventory to actually measure the movement of status over time. And so provocatively, what I say is that people have a status phenotype, which is their measured status on a variety of aspects. And then there's an underlying status genotype, and that's the status that can be transmitted to the next generation. And so what's actually happening here is that this thing is what's being transmitted very strongly, but it's kind of loosely linked to the measured aspects of status in any generation, so that this link here turns out to be relatively weak, right? But there's a stronger, much stronger underlying link that's going on here, right? And this is titled in this way deliberately provocatively because it turns out that if status was inherited genetically, this would be the structure that would hold, right? And so it raises this interesting question: what is it then that's driving status inheritance, right? Am I who I am because of the genetic code, or because of the social circumstances, the connections, the culture, all that other stuff, right, that people have? And so as I say, that's the thing that I really want to talk about today is what is transmitting this deeper status? Is it family resources? Is it family culture? Is it social networks? Or horror of horrors, could it actually be genes? Right? Now, the one thing, when I'm going to talk about genetics is, I realize that this is a very subject that people react very strongly sometimes against. And the important thing is that, first let's think about what the patterns are here, what it is, and then let's think about, well, what does this mean? What are the implications, right? And so we should just first think about, well, what would such an explanation look like? And then later think about what this means. And it turns out that, my wife, her career is, she defends people on death row. They love genetic determinism, because in that case, they want to show that what their client did was preordained and was inherited, and that was not something they had really control under, right? And so the interesting thing is that in some cases, we like genetic, but it turns out that what we don't like is when people are successful at something, that then you say that there's some genetic component there. And so there's actually, but in scientific terms, it should be symmetrical, right? If we believe that a lot of acts of violence or criminality can actually have genetic origins, then we should be equally open to believing that other acts of economic success or educational success could also have such kind of underpinnings. But we'll come back to that, and I realize that this is difficult terrain. So what I want to then talk about is what is the evidence? Can we rule out genetic inheritance? Now, as I say, what makes genetic inheritance seem possible is that we see this relative constancy of inheritance across so many different societies and so many different social settings. And so we think that it could just be something about the way families form, the way people assortatively mate in marriage, and then the way they transmit characteristics to their children. Could this really be the underpinning of this persistence that we're seeing? And so what I'm going to talk about here are various studies. One is, what's the pattern of inheritance of social status? And I can show you that if it's genetic in origin, it has very strong predictions about exactly what that pattern has to look like. We can also ask, what happens when people are adopted, right? When there's no genetic connection between parents and children, what happens to the outcomes of children, right? And that's a very strong test. And then another issue is, what about groups that marry endogamously? Okay, and suppose I took this room and I divided you up into two groups. I put all the short people, my type of people, over here, and I put all the tall people here. And then I said, from now on, short people marry short people, tall people marry tall people. That's the new rule. King Greg. What would happen? What would happen in the first generation is the short people would get taller and the tall people would get shorter. because there's a lot of short people who are there because they're accidentally short, right? They didn't get the vitamin supplement or whatever it is, right? Or they got sick when the growth phase came, right? There's lots of accidents that make people shorter. And then amongst the tall people, there's a lot of people who are just accidentally tall, right? And so there's something like 300 genes that control height, right? But there's still this kind of random connection between the genes and the actual height you express. And so in that first phase, what you would actually see is a narrowing of the gap. But what would happen if there was no intermarriage between these groups from then on is that after one generation, those relative heights would stay the same till the rest of time, right? Because the height is controlled genetically. We know that. It's in modern high-income societies. And this group would just happen to have a certain set of genes. The other group would have a certain set of genes. There's no intermixing between them. And so the average height would actually just stay the same over time. And so a strong prediction, if social success is actually determined through genetic purposes, is that groups that marry endogamously will not regress to the mean. And they will stay either below or above the mean forever if they don't intermarry with the rest of the population. And it turns out there are interesting historical populations where we can actually observe that, right? And so one of them, for example, is the Coptic population in Egypt. For 1,000 years has not intermarried with the rest of the population. And then we can say, well, what happened to the Coptic population? On the other hand, the Jewish population in America strongly intermarries now with the rest of the population. And so again, we can say, well, what happens when a group that is elite like that actually intermarries? And the answer is that that group will regress to the mean, okay? And so that we can look at that. And then the other question we could ask is, well, how do elites get formed? And so again, people writing recently have wanted to argue that religions can create elites, that particular cultures, and so you must have seen this book about the tiger mom, right? That if you adopt a certain set of kind of East Asian values and you constantly berate your children, they'll play the piano very well, and they'll do well, or constantly encourage them, they'll do well. And so there is this belief that that groups can adopt certain ideologies, certain practices, certain beliefs, that will actually create an elite population. If it's based on genetics, what we'll actually find is that when you get some elite subgroup in the population, it will be because something caused the upper group in a population to somehow be selected out. There'll be some process that selected this group from a general population, and that all elites will be traceable to some larger general population. And there was this selection process that created those, and it's nothing to do with ideology, practices, religion, race, anything like that. It's just a process of some kind of selection from a larger population that created this group that's elite or underclass. And then the other thing we can look at is what happens when you get shocks to family size. And so in England from 1800 to 1880, family size was random. And it varied between about 1 and 20 children. And so you can ask, well, what happens if you happen to end up in the family with 20 children? If really social outcomes are encoded in people's genes, that should have very little impact, right? But if it really is a function of how much attention your parents can pay to you, how much resources they can give you, then we should see significant effects from family size, and then we would know this is not a function of genetics. And also birth order, again. If it turns out being the oldest kid makes you much more successful than later children, again, we could actually tell that it can't be due to genetics. And so what's interesting is there's lots of different things we can look at here and kind of subject this kind of idea to a lot of tests about could it plausibly work. And so looking at this, as I say, height transmission it's very nice. It's a process that's largely genetic. We know a tremendous amount about that because almost all health studies involve measuring people's heights. And so you get tremendous amount of information. And so they actually know, as I say, something like 300 different genes that control heights. And each one has a very tiny influence on heights. And if we're talking about social success, it would be a very similar process if it's genetic. It's going to be just the combination of a very large number of genes that have very small influence on the outcome. And so whatever is happening, if social success is going to be genetic, it's got to kind of mirror height inheritance in terms of its characteristics. And one of the things you see immediately with height is that you get this interesting kind of linearity. You move back towards the mean, but you move back at the bottom at the same rate as you move back at the top, right? And you get a very characteristic pattern, a very linear pattern here of if I'm above the mean, I move back towards the mean, but it's very predictable how far I am, how much I'm going to move back towards the mean. And the other thing that's interesting about heights is that there's no such thing as a kind of a height trap at the bottom, right? Where people get stuck at low heights and then you stay generation after generation, you always move back, right? And you actually see, as I say, that the bottom has as much social mobility as the top, right, in this distribution. And so this is very characteristic, as I say, of multifactorial genetic inheritance. For the United States, here's the regression to the mean of income across generations. And so this is parent income measured by percentiles from the bottom to the top. And this is child income, again measured by percentiles from the bottom to the top. And it's not completely linear, right? There's slight deviations at the top and at the bottom. But this looks very much like height regression to the mean, right? And one of the things this is saying here is that you're really not observing a different process at one end of the distribution compared to the other. And with social processes, you would think that might well be the case. And one of the things that's impressive about social mobility is the families at the very bottom are the ones who are going to improve most, right? I mean, that's a stunning fact, because you think about the desperate circumstances of the people who are the bottom 1 or 2% of the income distribution, but they are the ones who are actually going to improve most in terms of their relative income rank in the next generation. And so as I say, what's interesting here is there is this kind of nice linearity, right? And if we found that this curve went like up like this and down like this, or something like that, we'd say it's a different process. It can't just be genetic processes here. It's some kind of social process that's driving this. But as I say, this is very impressive data that's saying it's linear, right? It really looks like height inheritance, okay? And then for England, we've got wealth, again, by deciles here, and this is not such good data as the American data. This is for England over the past 150 years, but again, it's pretty close to linear, right, in terms of your ranking. Here's occupational status in England. This is, again, somewhat weaker data. This is a bit more questionable, kind of close to linear, but not obvious yet. But we can actually get more data to see how good the fit is if we carry on. So the next thing that comes up with genetic explanations is what's the correlation amongst relatives? And so with genetic explanations of transmission, there's a very predictable pattern of correlation that you will observe amongst relatives, which depends on the genetic connection between people. And so when we're looking at these correlations, one of the things you'll find with genetic explanations is the parent-child correlation should be roughly the same as the sibling correlation. And that's actually a very surprising fact. Because if you think about environment, so let me give a personal story, right? So I grew up in a nice suburban home in Glasgow, though Glasgow was the murder capital of England at that time, but, but we were in one of the nicer districts of the murder capital. We had parents who were very interested in education. We had our own bedrooms. We didn't have to go out and work. You know, everything was, the nutrition was good. We ate salad, which was unheard of in Glasgow, right? Eating green things. My father came from a family of 12, and he was 9th in that family of 12. And his family lived in 3 rooms, the 12 of them plus the 2 parents. And he was taken out of high school and sent to work for part of his time in high school and barely managed to graduate from high school. And so what's interesting there is that our environment was very different. right? And so you would think from parents to children, there's going to be a fair amount of variation in environment, right? Just caused by these, the random factors. How many children were there in that family? What were their circumstances? Things change over time. But if you compare my environment with my brothers, 2 brothers and sister, our environment was incredibly similar, right? I mean, we had essentially exactly the same social environment, right? If you think that social forces are really responsible for people's outcomes, what you're going to very strongly think is, well, we should be much more correlated than we are with our parents, right? Because the environment is much more likely to be similar for siblings than it is for the parent-child combination, right? Because the parent's creating an environment, and typically they're not going to discriminate. It's not like, you get nothing. You're the favored child, right? And so one of the interesting things is that if we found that these correlations are very different, that would be strong evidence against genetic explanation of this, right? And again, things like the cousin correlation should equal the great-grandfather to great-grandchild correlation, right? So these are strong predictions that don't obviously follow from any kind of social or cultural or other models of inheritance of status. And so in some sense, we can get data. So one of the things, the project I'm engaged upon now is to try and derive a whole set of lineages where we can actually measure all of these different correlations. Now, it turns out that what would this pattern be? And I apologize, this slide has a lot of mathematics, but if you look at it, it's actually relatively simple. And so it turns out h squared is the correlation between mid-parent and child, and that's the hereditability of a trait. And then m is the correlation, the genetic correlation of husband and wife. And so everything actually just depends on those 2 numbers, right? And so if there's matching according to underlying genetics, then you get this whole pattern of predictions where what's actually happening is for every step away in terms of genetic connection, the correlation should drop by a factor of 1 plus m over 2. And so if the parents, if you just married randomly, the correlation would drop by 1/2 in each generation. If the parents matched perfectly, the correlation would not drop. Right? It would just stay the same over time. And so it turns out that, as I say, you can derive this whole set of implied correlations that come from genetic processes if status is inherited genetically. And then you could potentially test these. And so here's height, we know, as I say, is genetically, in modern societies, is genetically controlled. And so here in Iceland, we have the measured correlations and the predicted values. And there you see that parent-child height correlations are roughly the same as sibling height correlations, right? And that, as I say, is going to be a characteristic of genetic inheritance. And then you can see that these correlations should be much weaker. The grandparent and the avuncular, they should be the same as each other. Here's the predicted values on this model, and it's pretty close. And then the one that doesn't fit so well is cousins, but you can see there's only 112 observations on cousins, so there's going to be a lot of noise in that measurement. But as I say, one of the things you can actually test in terms of genetic inheritance is we can observe these various correlations, and they should follow a very characteristic pattern. And if we don't see that pattern, we could actually rule out genetic inheritance, right? And one thing would be, for example, if siblings had a correlation of 0.8 in terms of height, and parent-child was 0.43, you would say it's not, it's environmental things that are determining height. It's not genetics that are determining that. And one of the other things that's actually very interesting about genetic explanations is it actually contains in it this very interesting fact, which is that siblings are actually going to be very different, right? And psychologists have spent a lot of time puzzling over that. Why are siblings so different in families? But there's a strong genetic reason in terms of genetic inheritance why, even if there's strong persistence, that siblings actually will have a lot of variation. And it's actually, it's something that's actually inherently contained in genetic explanations. And so, as I say, if culture and resources and networks matter, we think the sibling correlation should exceed the parent-child. And for long-run social mobility, it turns out in a genetic explanation, it depends purely on 1 plus m over 2, where m is the correlation of the parents. And so one thing that then immediately emerges is, if you're really going to have a persistence of social status of 0.8 and have that driven by genetics, then the parents have got to be matching up very closely, right? And another thing we can then test is, do parents really match as closely as would be implied in order to actually drive this process through genetic means, right? Because it's got to be the case that somehow when love comes into play, you end up marrying someone who shares a lot of genetics with you, right? Even though you don't even observe this genetics, that somehow there's something that's guiding you to say, we're going to match up in terms of this underlying genetics, right? And it's got to be fairly powerful. And as I say, so the test we have here is we have a data set of about 60,000 people in England in family lineages that stretch back to 1780, where we can actually observe a lot of these outcomes, and we know all of the connectedness. And here's, and we haven't done a lot of this yet. The stuff with the more remote relatives, we have to actually develop more data. But here's a simple test of father-son correlation versus brothers. So one thing is, did you attend Oxford or Cambridge, right? The correlation of father-son, 0.28, brothers, 0.31. It's very close. What about your wealth at death, 0.51, 0.54. It's very, very similar. What about your occupational status there? It's slightly more divergence, 0.61, 0.66. But it's very similar, these divergences. And then the one thing is, were you working when observed between ages 11 and 20? There you actually see a very significant divergence. Where brothers, if one brother is working, it's much more likely the other brother is working, and the connection's much weaker with parents. But the interesting thing there is that that's something we think of, well, that's something the parents can have a lot of control over, but might in the long run not play that much role in terms of the child's underlying kind of social status. And so it would actually be nice to observe some things where this rule is actually breaking down. And then for assortative mating, there's been a lot of skepticism in terms of assortative mating, because it turns out when you look at the genotype, the phenotype, people don't actually match particularly closely in terms of genotype. And so for things like height, the correlation is 0.2 or 0.3 between spouses. For education, that's one of the highest, but it's still only about 0.5. And as I say, if these numbers indicate the underlying genotype matching, it would say that this persistence that we're observing must have a social cause. It can't have a genetic cause, because it's so much stronger than would be predicted by this kind of matching, right? But it's possible that when, as I say, when we see this education feature matching only at 0.5 correlation, it can be that there's actually a much deeper underlying matching. Because it could be that somehow, in terms of the overall social status, people are actually matching much more closely. So it might not be the case that your spouse happens to be highly educated when you are, but it turns out that they're from a certain type of family, they have a certain kind of occupational structure, that if we had a more comprehensive inventory, we'd say, oh, no, you guys are very close matches in terms of social status. And this is something where I'm not going to be able to explain. Only people in certain branches of economics would understand the reasoning here, so I'm just going to gloss over this. But it turns out when we look at our correlation in wealth in England, and what we're actually comparing here is people's spouses with their brothers, because women's wealth is not a good representation of family wealth in England in this period. You can see that the observed correlation is only 0.21, so it's very loose. But it turns out there's a technique we can use where we try and get at that underlying correlation. And what's called, it's using instruments, and where we take occupation or education as an indirect measure of the underlying status, and we substitute that. And there, wherever we do that, that correlation jumps up. And that is completely consistent with this kind of idea that people are matching on deeper characteristics. There's a lot of noise in any of the individual characteristics, but there's a much deeper process of matching that's going on here. And as I say, that's completely consistent with the idea that people are actually connecting genetically in a way that would allow for genetic transmission of these traits. So we're going to run out of time, but let me get on to this very interesting studies of adopted versus biological children. And so there's a wonderful study that was done by an economist at Dartmouth, where after the Korean War, a private independent American businessman was kind of distressed by the number of orphaned children that he saw on the streets in Korea and in orphanages. And he organized his own kind of private charity to have these children adopted in the United States. And this continued for many years. And what was interesting about this was that people were screened and qualified to adopt, and then they were just placed on a list where, like, you're number 13, you're number 14, you're number 15. And then they knew nothing about these babies in Korea, right? They had typically been abandoned, they knew nothing about the parents, and so these children would just come up. It's like, this child is the next child, well, it goes to number 13, this child goes to number 14, and so on, right? And so what's interesting about this is it was complete random assignment of children to parents. But the interesting thing about these parents is that their income actually varied enormously by a factor of more than 20 to 1. And then what this diagram shows is the income, the child's family income when they grew up. And this line here shows what about the biological children in these families. And there you see the expected correlation of family income with child's income. And then these are the adopted children. And what you see is you could get adopted into families which had 20 times the amount of income. It made no difference to the eventual income of these children, right? And it really, I mean, this is astonishing, kind of, that these parents somehow couldn't influence the adult incomes of their children, even though, as I say, they had vastly different resources available. And then another thing that you can do with this data is that many of these families adopted more than one child, and these children then are unconnected. They have no genetic correlation. And if the environment doesn't matter, then in any characteristic that they have, they will be uncorrelated. If the environment matters, then in any characteristic they have, they'll be correlated. But you can compare their correlation with the correlation of the biological children of the same families. And then you can compare, well, how much closer is the correlation as you move from being unconnected to being biologically connected, right? And from this, you can infer the proportion of any characteristic the children exhibit that's explained by nurture or explained by nature. And so, as I say, we know that height in modern America is entirely explained by nature, and this data shows this, right? There's some that's just random, but that essentially nurture doesn't explain height, right, for these children. What about family income? The correlation of 0.1 is actually explained by, so there is some influence of families, right? But it turns out that influence has nothing to do with the income of the family. It's some other characteristic of families that's actually causing their children to have some kind of correlated income. Part of that might just be where they live in the United States, right? Because if you live in a high-income place, then the children will end up anyway with correlated incomes. But what you can see is that nature explains 3 times as much correlation as nurture does in the case of income. So these studies don't show a complete absence of family influence, but they consistently show that 3/4 of the variation is actually coming from nature as opposed to 1/4 that's coming from nurture. And then whether you completed 4 years of college, again, it turns out that genetics is actually explaining much more of this than the family. And as I say, that's very interesting because families can do so much in terms of getting their kids through college, right? You can hire tutors, you can do all kinds of other stuff, you can get them into a nurturing environment. If you come to a big state university like the one I teach in, then you can disappear without a trace, but if you go to a small liberal arts expensive college, you can do much better. And so these parents can do all of this, but you can see that it's still the case that the parents don't explain that much. But then some things are interesting, and one of these is smoking turns out to be largely genetic, whether you smoke or not. And that's amazing. You would think, again, that would be something, family environment, very important. But drinking alcohol It's totally social, right? It has very little to do with genetic. And so it's interesting patterns. And then the other thing is, if you go to the right family, the quality of the college you go to can actually be significantly raised, right? And so what the evidence is here is that parents can actually do a lot to help the children along the way. But as you move to things like what their ultimate income is, the influence of parents actually turns out to be relatively modest, right? And what that is actually saying comfortingly is America's a fairer place than you might have imagined, in the sense that it's not all about your parents, right? A lot of it seems to be about the inherent characteristics of children, okay? So that's adoption studies. And what about persistent elites? And so you get some of these, and they're very interesting. So the Egyptian Coptic population and the Jewish population remained elite for something like 1,300 years. They're still elite, the Coptic population. Eastern European Jews, 1,300, 1,900. The Christians in Syria, Jordan, Iraq have been elite. And then the Brahmins in India have been for more than 1,000 years an elite population. And if these groups intermarriage with other groups in the population, then we'd have to say that persistence implies that it's something cultural that's keeping them in that status. If they don't intermarry, then we'd have to say it's potentially genetic. And then the question is, well, how did these groups get formed? And so what I'm going to say here is the characteristic of all of these groups is a complete absence of intermarriage with the rest of the population, right? And the social structure in these societies is such that you do get this division between these groups. And so as I say, it again is very consistent with the idea that there could be something genetic that underlies this. And then the other question is, how do you become elite? And so the Jewish population in many societies is an elite population, but it turns out that the existing Jewish population in Europe by 1400 was only about 10% of the original Jewish population in the world, in the Mediterranean. 90% of Jews had converted to other religions, mainly to Christianity, but the process was very selective. And basically, high-status Jews remained Jewish, and low-status Jews converted. And this actually happens in many societies where it's easier for people lower in the social ladder to adopt the majority religion, and the ones who resist conversion are often those of kind of higher status who have more resources. And then in 1400, only about 1% of all Jews were Ashkenazim. They're now about 80% of the entire Jewish population, and they were at that time an elite already amongst the Jewish population. They were bankers and financiers who'd moved from Italy to Germany. And so the interesting thing again there is you see that the kind of elite populations, that it's just this kind of selection process that's going on that's identifying, that's selecting this group from the general population. In Muslim societies, the remaining minorities are typically elite. Why is that the case? Well, Islam was actually an incredibly tolerant religion in most centuries of its existence, and so they did not insist on conversion when they would conquer other societies. But if you didn't convert, you had to pay a head tax. And so what happens in societies like Egypt is that Copts were just the run-of-the-mill population. When the Islamic invasions came, it was the Jewish population and the Greek Christians who were the elite. The Copts were the other 95% of the population, but what happened systematically was that poor Copts became Muslim, and about 5% of the Copts remained Coptic, and they were the elites amongst the Coptic population. And you can actually even show that geographically, economic circumstances dictated which areas would convert to Islam and which wouldn't. And so places which had important Coptic shrines would tend to stay Coptic, because they were serving a tourist trade that was Coptic, and so there was an economic advantage to still remaining Coptic in those areas. And so there's a kind of nice evidence that you can bring in that actually shows this process. And so again, as I say, you've got this process. And now I come from this milieu where my family is originally Irish Catholic, and where there's a very strong division between Catholics and Protestants in Ireland, and much animosity between these groups. And so my brother, who's a doctor, asked the mother of his Protestant wife whether it would be okay if they got married, and she said, "I'd really prefer it if you didn't." And that's, as I say, within the last 30 years. And so what's interesting is that in Ireland, the Protestants were the elite, the Catholics were the underclass. I mean, amazingly, about a third of Protestants in Ireland converted to Catholicism over time, but they were the poor Protestants. And substantial numbers of Catholics converted to Protestantism. They were the educated Catholics. And so you actually get this endogamous process where the Protestant eliteness is actually being maintained here by selective movement of population between these different groups. And so it's nothing inherently potentially about the ideology or other social circumstances of the groups. It's just the nature of the society that's causing this selective conversion. And so lastly, let me say a little bit about social status in the United States. And so we have one very simple measure of this now, which is how many doctors are there per 1,000 of any population in the United States. Doctors are very elite now in America, and because we have a comprehensive register of doctors, we can actually easily measure social status of groups just by looking at that. And so the question is, who are the most elite Americans now? The answer is Copts. There's more Coptic doctors. There's about, and this is, the average is 1. There's 13 times as many Copts who are doctors as in the average population in the United States. And that's just caused by the US immigration process, where if you get from Egypt to the United States, you have to be pretty educated normally to make that movement. What's the next group? It's Hindus. These are going to be the new, and the Hindus are much more frequent than Copts, so this is the new great upper class in the United States. And so actually it's encouraging that we're actually creating a society where the elite is going to be incredibly diverse in modern America. And again, this is immigration policy in the United States, and the fact that H-1B skilled visas are very heavily used by Indians, right? What's another group? Indian Christians. What's another group? Iranian Muslims. And so even though in Iran, Muslims are an underclass compared to various minorities there, again, the process of immigration from Iran actually means that Muslims in the United States are an elite. And what you're seeing here is these are every kind of belief and ideology that's associated with these groups. There's nothing special about any particular religion. Maronite Christians, Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardic Jews, Koreans, Chinese, these are all elites. Filipinos, Black Africans are a significant elite now within the United States. And again, that's the process of migration from Africa, where it's the elites from places like Nigeria who are now moving to the United States. And it's again illustrating this has nothing to do with race. It's to do with what the processes are of migration and selection from within specific populations. And then Greeks, Armenians, Japanese, Vietnamese, Black Haitians are also an elite within the United States. And the last thing, but actually, why don't I summarize family size? The interesting thing is it doesn't matter, right? The fact that my father came from a family of 12 makes no difference. The outcomes depend on the characteristics of the parent. They don't depend on the size of the family, right? But we've got a few minutes left, so there's been a lot of kind of controversial stuff here, so I'd be interested to hear some questions, reactions, rejections. Yes?
So looking at your Oxbridge graph,
Right.
you were talking about how the rate at which these family names have meaning is falling constantly. Don't you think that's a little misleading to say, considering that your y-axis was on a logarithmic scale?
Oh, but what's actually happening is, it's correct that it's logarithmic, but it turns out when we calculate that regression towards the mean, it's actually fitted by a constant number, right? And when we're looking at regression towards the mean, there's a complicated process by which we translate that overrepresentation into what the implied mean of the distribution is, and then how fast that mean is approaching the social mean. And it would take half an hour to explain, the kind of underlying logic of that. But you're right that it is on this logarithmic axis, but it's actually a more complicated process that's involved in trying to infer from that overrepresentation what the average status of that group is and how rapidly that average status is approaching the mean. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could comment on the rising income inequality in the United States, just where some of these studies fit into that.
So if you ask, well, what would be the policy conclusion of what you're looking at here, what my interpretation is that a lot of people's outcomes are, they're not all determined. I mean, so even with this intergenerational correlation of 0.8, that implies about 2/3 of your outcome is predictable from your birth. There's still 1/3 of it that comes from somewhere else, right? So that, but a lot of people's lives are actually predictable. And if we understand that a lot of that is just coming from the qualities that people inherit, then I think it's a very strong argument for saying we should limit inequalities in societies, right? Because even in a society like Sweden, where there's not a huge incentive to be, to achieve, because you don't get that much more income, you get the same kind of persistence, you get the same kind of families who do well in each generation. We don't need those inequalities to drive people to achieve stuff in society. And the important conclusion here is, if you compare the poor in Sweden with the poor in the United States, there's no difference in social mobility between those groups. But it's much better to be in Sweden if you're going to be poor than it is in the United States, right? And it's absolutely the case. And America, by having greater inequality, it's not doing anything to the rate of social mobility. It's not changing that rate of social mobility. A lot of that's being determined by the characteristics of families and the inheritance of those characteristics by children. And so I think once we understand that that's the nature of the process, then we would say, look, why would we want these accidents of birth to lead some people to have miserable lives and some people to have more income than they could ever possibly spend? And so I'm a strong advocate for saying the good society is Sweden or Denmark or Norway. I mean, these are societies that have achieved amazing amounts in terms of reducing the inequalities to the different groups within the society. But interestingly, it's not, they haven't managed to change the rate of social mobility, right? And that's why that's not what you should focus on. It's the inequality that you want to, as far as possible, compress. Question?
Looking at these really interesting statistics of parent and sibling correlations, you said that if there are very different correlations between the parents and the siblings, that we can say that it is highly environmental rather than genetic. Can we also then definitely say that if there are very similar correlations, that it is certainly not environmental and definitely genetic?
No. Right. So the question here was, can we conclude from this similarity of correlation between parent-child and siblings that really this is a genetic process at work? And the answer is no. Right? So, but one of the nice things about, as I say, genetic explanations is that they have very testable implications. But the problem is that all we can do is conclude definitively that's not possible, right? So all we can observe here is patterns that are very consistent with this, right? Though, as I say, one of the things that is striking and is very interesting is, and we can see this in this data in England, is if you're at the bottom, you are not going to stay there. There is no poverty trap in a society like England, nor in the United States as well. And that's a stunning fact, that eventually those families will climb back to the average, because you would think, given social forces and stuff like that, that once you're in these kind of desperate circumstances, that would just reproduce itself generation after generation. But the amazing thing is that these families systematically are destined to do better and eventually, typically, get back to kind of average status. Another thing that's actually stunning is that the elites are defenseless in the long run. You would think American elites, other elites, would be able to reinforce their position, to reproduce themselves, to maintain their position at the top of society. And the amazing thing is, elites cannot do this. all elites are destined to pass. It's just that it takes 300 to 500 years, right? but it's still an interesting and kind of stunning social fact that and we observe many individual families here in England, and it really is the case that almost all of these families that get to very high position, eventually they're still doing well, the children 5 generations later, but they're pretty ordinary, right? They're pretty close to the mean by then. And so and I think one of the things it teaches us is we really are just atoms in this wider social process, right? There's an incredible kind of intermixing and commonality to humanity, right? And we see these families moving up and down, moving through this social space, and you realize that it's hubris to think that really we have any control over this, that there really are kind of systematic social processes that we're subject to. And the other thing, as I say, is that they're very systematic, that we can predict with high accuracy that if you're at this position as a group of people at this point, 200 years later, here's where you're going to be, right? And as I say, it's interesting, there are not a lot of things in economics where we can actually make kind of systematic predictions of what's going to happen in this way. If you're asking me what's the stock market's going to be a month from now, forget it, right? But if you're asking me what's the relative position going to be of various groups in the United States a generation from now, then the argument is yes, we can actually make pretty strong predictions about that. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Enough.